This is episode 30 with Jeff Piontek and Daniel Pesut. Welcome back to the Future Intelligent Leadership Podcast. If you're interested in innovative wisdom and practical tools for leading in a complex, uncertain, and exponentially changing world, then this podcast is for you. Aloha and welcome to this episode of the Future Intelligent Leadership Podcast. This is your host, Tyler Mongan, co-founder and chief learning officer at Haku Global. If you want to find out more about how Haku Global can help accelerate leadership future intelligence and scale it across your organization, then visit us at www.haku.global. In this episode, I'm joined by guests Jeff Piontek and Daniel Pesut. Jeff is the Vice President of Global Business Development at Perfection Learning. He is an education expert working around the world building experiences that engage students and empower them for success. His core passion is in the area of STEM or STEAM, science, technology, engineering, and arts and mathematics. And he enhances it logically with the R for reading, because if you can't read, you will be challenged to be successful in every phase of life. Jeff is committed to being a resource to his business partners, colleagues, contacts, and friends, with a professional motto of, if I can't help you, I know someone who can. Daniel is Professor Emeritus at University of Minnesota. He is an innovative nurse educator, academic career coach, author, keynote speaker, organizational consultant, futurist, and trusted advisor. He is skilled in helping people create desired futures with creativity, innovation, and foresight. Committed to the future of nursing and healthcare through development of foresight leadership, Daniel influences and educates the next generation of healthcare leaders to reason with critical, creative, complexity, strategic, systems, and integral thinking. If you're interested in exploring the time zone paradox, the challenges of quality online education, why we need at least 20% of the people in the world to be futurists, how to close the triangle for global network weaving, the future of education in a digital world, and why you cannot know where you're going until you know where you have been, then this episode is for you. Let's listen. Thank you, Daniel and Jeff, for joining me today on this episode of the Future Intelligent Leadership Podcast. Really excited to have you here today. And as always, I want to start with this key question of how can leadership be more smart or intelligent about the future, given this climate of complexity, uncertainty, and exponential change that we see in the world today? And I'd like you for both to answer it from your perspective of your work. And I'll just start with Daniel.
Well, thanks for having me, Tyler. I've been a professor of nursing for 40 years, most recently having retired from the University of Minnesota School of Nursing, where I've taught leadership courses. And the thing that I think is most important, and I've tried to instill in my academic career with students, is really be clear about what your strengths are, what your values are, and what your contribution is. And so those are key, I think, in terms of any kind of leadership skill set. And I've always encouraged them to write a paper, actually, about that in terms of what their strengths are and values and contributions. And I'm a particularly fan of the Gallup Strength Finders. And Gallup says, of course, all followers want four things from leaders: trust, compassion, stability, and hope. And so I think if a person knows their strengths and they have the strategies to elicit trust, compassion, and stability and hope from their followers, they are really set up well in terms of moving forward with that personal insight as well as their professional contribution. I also am a great fan of Lance Secretan's work. He's got a great book called The Spark, the Flame, the Torch, Inspire Self, Inspire Others, Inspire the World. And he really boils leadership down to three things. I just love the simplicity of it. It's called mastery, chemistry, and delivery. And mastery, he relates to a person's constant ability to be able to learn. Chemistry is that ability to engage empathetically with people. And then delivery is really, how are you meeting the people's needs that you're serving? And so how deep is your listening to acknowledge those needs? So strengths, values, contribution, mastery, chemistry, and delivery. Those are my key things. And one more, I might say, because you've asked the word about complexity. For many years, I was on the Plexus Institute trustee group, and they're a group that is devoted to the application of complexity science principles to healthcare and the environment. And I really learned a lot from those folks, but there is a woman, Jennifer Garvey Berger, who's written a lot about complexity. And she talks about 3 simple habits for folks. 1, ask different questions. 2, take multiple perspectives. And 3, see and think systems. And I think that's great advice too, in terms of managing the challenges that we're faced with. And, you know, I've always had futures thinking as a red thread in my particular career, because I was tasked early on in the 90s with developing a curriculum for visionary leadership for nurses. As I delved into that topic, it just, you know, occurred to me, vision presupposes a future sense of orientation, and got involved then with the World Future Society and the Institute for Alternative Futures. But I am particularly puzzled, and you might have some insight in this, or Jeff might have some insight in this, why more people aren't more foresight oriented. Why are people so stuck in the here and now? And so this whole notion about a person's time print and how you get people to move from the past to the present into the future is really the thing I'm struggling with most nowadays. Because if healthcare ever needed to think future forward, it's now, and it's not. It's sort of trapped by the COVID, and it's very present oriented, and you see references to the past all the time. So jumpstarting that foresight intelligence, if you guys have got cues or strategies for that, I want to know them.
Great, thanks, Daniel. And Jeff, from your perspective of your work, how do you answer this question of how can leadership be more intelligent about the future?
You know, I think that one of the things you look at is the leaders that I was surrounded with when I was going through my early career, as well as people I read about as well. Daniel, it's great to hear, you know, a lot of similar people, a lot of similar methodologies of what we would look at. And that's probably because we're in the same type of field, even though you're in nursing higher ed and I'm in K-12 education more so. But, you know, one of the things is a Hawaiian proverb is you can't know where you're going to go until you know where you've been. And actually, you have to know your past to be able to prepare for the future. And I think a lot of people get stuck in looking at things about the past that they think, well, it's always been that way, we can't change it. In education, particularly, especially K-12 education, people get stuck in that mindset where they don't see the big picture for 5-10 years down the road because they're worried about the class or the group of students they have currently. You know, COVID has transitioned education into a whirlwind now. I mean, where we're going to be in the next year, and people keep saying returning to normal, there is no normal any longer. It's a new normal. And, you know, looking at a leadership skill set, you know, someone like Jack Welch wouldn't really apply to education, nor would someone, you know, in the Bill Gates realm, you know, working with Gates Foundation. I learned a lot from the organization and just how they think about things externally. But I think that I come at more from an empathetic approach, looking at how do we actually meet the needs of the person in front of me that day, that year, to be able to make them a better person for the future. And I think that that's one of the things. I think that Jack Ma actually just wrote about it maybe 6 or 8 months ago during the pandemic, talking about emotional quotient and how that actually ties into leadership. And that's a key skill set right now for a lot of our leaders that they don't unfortunately have. And I think that's something we have to look at our, you know, millennials that are coming up, our Gen X, Gen Y, that are in those roles that will actually fulfill that in the future. So I think that to answer Daniel's question that he posed to us, I think that people get their feet stuck in the mud a lot. And I think that's one of the things we can talk about here as to how we can look at the future. You know, fortunately being involved in some futurist studies and working with some futurists in the past, I think it's forced me to look at things of how things would be in the future. Maybe it's just growing up watching Star Trek then. You never know.
Well, so going back to your question, Daniel, how would you answer it if you knew the answer?
Well, I sort of delved into this. And so I don't know if you're familiar with Philip Zimbardo's work. It's called The Time Paradox. And he's got an interesting survey. And over his 30 years of research, he's determined that there are really 6 time zones that people operate in: 2 in the past, 2 in the present, and 2 in the future. And one has a positive spin and one has a negative spin. So the people that are into the past are always taken, putting together scrapbooks and memory books and dwelling and living there, or they have a deep regret about their past. People in the present are, he calls them, I think, hedonists, here and now, pain versus pleasure. And then in the future, he has this story, great little YouTube clip on secret powers of time, where he talks about people in Italy. Someone comes up to him after his speech and says, there is no word for the future in our language based on what you just said. And so that has informed my thinking. And so I really sort of listen to people periodically. And when I go into an organization, I can tell what their meta program is for time. When you go into a room and you propose a change and they say, well, Mary Lynn would never have done that. Mary Lynn would never have done. And Mary Lynn is a picture on the wall in the boardroom and she's been dead for 20 years, and it's sort of like, oh, okay, I get it. They're sorting for the past here. So it's going to be an uphill battle to get them to think for the future. But I was struck recently reading an article by Joe Boris, who's, I guess, a futurist in Australia, who did some research. And he seems to think that people with an intuition on the Myers-Briggs, I'm an INTP, but people that are intuitive seem to be more future-oriented. And they also talked about some of Claire Graves' work about second-tier thinking, people who, have developed along the cognitive adult development path that seem to be more strategists. They have more of a future orientation than people who consider themselves as an expert. And so that gives you some clues, but boy, to ferret that out in an organization or with a group or a set of individuals is really challenging, I think.
Jeff, any follow-up thoughts on that?
You know what? I would agree with Daniel in the sense of when you're actually doing leadership training and you're working with either educational leaders, business leaders, or even just teachers as a whole. I think that looking at where they are is one of the key components, obviously. But looking at the world they're going to live in, and the world of AI, remote work, the transition to where now I think it's like this. I think McKinsey came out with a report. There's 100 million workers across 8 different countries. 25% of them need to be retrained or uptrained back into the workforce. I think that's one of the things that people have to realize, that people choose because of the safety thing. They don't want to look outside their little box, and looking at the future is a scary thing. I mean, that's for sure. And I think looking at the future of automation, robotics, AI, cognitive computing, data science, I think those are the key components that will scare people, especially in the education field. I mean, in workforce as well, I think that's one of the challenges we have.
I think that's interesting. It's like, as I think you're saying, like, as people look into the future, they're seeing a future where they don't fit in, right? Or they have to become a different person to fit in. And if they're, if they're in their 50s or 60s and they're still working, that's a big, it takes a lot of effort to make that change, and get there. And it's so much easier. And I think the brain, it's efficient because it has the past to fall back onto a lot of times. And that's an efficiency mechanism. So it's just energetically easier just to fall back onto the past. And so I'm curious, like, from your perspective, Daniel, with your work, especially in the medical field too, how do we get people to start thinking not just about the future, but also like maybe think of the past in more positive ways?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, one of the great resources that I rely on a lot is an organization called KnowledgeWorks. I don't know if you're familiar with that, Jeff, but it's is it in Ohio or something?
Yeah.
They do these projections about the future, Partners in Code, and they really are drilling down on K through 12 folks to change the way they practice in schools and even communities and organizing communities. And another great organization that I just really admire is called the Waters Foundation. They are all about teaching systems thinking skills in K through 12. And I think, once we get those youngins sensitized, and if they're coming along the pike with these great systems thinking skills and eye to the future and really mastering the technology that's emerging, I think that there will be more futures created. But I always think there's going to be this normal distribution of people with a future time sense. And I don't know, I say in my world, I'm trying to get people to be futuristic. We don't need a whole lot of them, maybe 16% of people to be futurist, because not everybody can handle it. And so we but need those early adopters, to come along and challenge the rest of us, the old 80-20 rule. I'd be happy if there were 20% futurists or 20% of the people thought futures, because they might bring the rest of us along. But there is, I think, a normal distribution that has to be navigated and managed.
Jeff, insights?
No, yeah, I would agree in the sense that, you have to have that, you'd hope it would be a normal distribution curve of people that thought about the future that way. Unfortunately, I think the reality is that it's much lower. Yeah. I pose ideas to people and they're like, well, that'll never work. I'm like, how do you know? Well, let's look at the research, let's look at the data to see whether or not it could be something that implemented not next week or next year, but 3 to 5 years down the road. Whoever thought education would be where we are now. I mean, I started teaching online in 2001. So if you could imagine how long ago that with Blackboard and just, simple chats. And I did it because I had grad students that were working and had families, and I was trying to be cognizant of their lives. But now it's become the norm, and it's actually, it's a scary time in education for this. Because people start looking at the future. They look at a future where they don't fit in, like you said, Tyler. But, and I'm 54. I just had to think about that for a second. Yeah. As you get this age, things start to dwindle a little bit. You think about stuff. I'm 54 and, I'm fortunate. My dad was a mainframe programmer. I remember punch cards. I remember, 8.5-inch floppies and 5.5-inch floppies. Oh, yeah. You show a kid now a 3.5-inch disc. They're like, what is that? That's the save button on the computer. That's what they think it is. So I think it is truthfully looking at the groups as a whole and how do we actually make sure that within our little ecosystems that we live in, trying to help people think big picture, long term.
And just follow up with that for you, Jeff, too, is because both of you, because you're both in education. One of the things I realized when I got in the futures work was that, just hit me how much of our education is spent on studying the past, right? And memorizing the past, and there's a lot of value there, of course, especially in medicine. But there's nothing dedicated to the future, really. I mean, even in business school, you get a little bit like you do a business plan, right? To do some future projections of what you could create. But that's it. Most of it's studying the past. What do you see in education that could be added in that would help us have more of an eye to the future?
So I think one of the key components is I actually was fortunate enough to attend a week-long seminar with the D School at Stanford and actually do some design thinking. And that helped me tremendously to look at things from a different perspective. Other, organizations like that work with you. One of them in Hawaii, I don't know if you remember them, Tyler, is called OceanIt.
Yep.
Very forward-thinking organization that supported schools. And that's where the private-public partnerships become key components to drivers of systemic change over time, because an organization that was focused on creating their workforce that they needed 5 years or 10 years down the road, and they were trying to enact that change by implementing design thinking at the school level, so they'd have those kids coming out of high school or universities with the skill set that they needed. So it's going to be those public-private partnerships in education, I think, that drive the systemic change the fastest, because it's funded externally and they can do a little bit more to get things done quicker from that regard. But I think design thinking has been a huge component in having people think differently about how they can look at the future.
That's great. Daniel,
I would agree with Jeff. We at the University of Minnesota have actually a doctorate of nursing practice program in health innovation and leadership. And we also have a post-baccalaureate certificate in healthcare design and innovation. And it's a partnership between the School of Nursing, the Center for Spirituality and Healing at the University of Minnesota, and the College of Design. And we take people who have baccalaureate degrees in all sorts of fields and put them through that 12 credit course certificate program, and they come out different people in terms of the design thinking aspect of that, empathy for the users, rapid prototyping, iteration, ideation, and that is actually infiltrating in the nursing profession quite large. The American Nurses Association just created over those last couple of years a division of innovation. University of Pennsylvania has now put innovation and design thinking courses in their nursing curriculum, along with Ohio State. And as I think more healthcare professionals and nurses in particular take on a design thinking mindset, that it will, I think, open things up to look at and reframe things in an entirely different way, from the point of view of the patient as well as from the nurse and the way service is delivered.
Yeah, I love design thinking. I think it's a great entry point for people. And I think it's something that children could even grasp, and get their head around and really change their perspective on things. I'm curious where you both see, from your perspective in your work, where are things headed in some way? Just kind of giving people some foresight. What are your thoughts on that, Jeff?
Well, I think one of the things that COVID has forced us to realize is that the industries are going to change, and education has to change as well, as because of proximity and physical proximity I'm talking about is going to change the way people work and the way people actually go to school. Medical care, of course, has always been a close proximity thing, but you're looking at just indoor production and warehousing. I work for a publishing company now, and we have a printing company as well as a textbook warehouse company, that we actually ship, warehouse, and distribute textbooks that we publish. Those things have changed dramatically. I mean, the way we're looking at things. Obviously, your supermarket has changed. So I think that what we're looking at is for our students that we're putting out of the K-12 system into either higher ed or into workforce, we have to make sure that they're prepared for whatever those new normals are, making sure that they have the idea that they can actually be in a role or in a position that they have the skill set to be successful. I think that's the biggest challenge we're going to look at. I mean, with COVID, the way things have changed. I think that remote work is going to be one of those things that now people are more used to. I don't think there's a lot of people going back to work as time goes on. Yeah. That's going to be something, as well as remote schooling, of course. I think that, automation and AI is going to be one of those things that's increasing as time goes on right now as well. Because, looking at just how we automate curriculum and curriculum design, as well as looking at data analytics around that's automated, and looking at even like a nursing program, how do professors that are teaching that nursing program, how do the students do on the boards over time, and how do they actually pass? And you can actually backwards design all of that data using structured and unstructured data in a model that provides that instantaneously now, which you couldn't 10 years ago. So I think that things like that are going to change education as a whole.
Yeah, I think big data is going to be huge. Right now, School of Nursing at Minnesota has a partnership with Optum Labs, and we have access to data on 1 million covered lives. And they are mining that data and looking at all sorts of patterns and changes in the way medications were delivered, and when's the best time to get a medication and when it's not effective anymore. And so that's going to all be turned, I think, into algorithms that are going to be predictive analytics about healthcare that we don't even know. Well, the one thing that I have a little concern about, though, is the future of the university in general. I follow a couple of people, futurists. Brian Alexander does a lot with the future of higher ed, and Marie Conway is a futurist that talks about the future of the university. And the fact that we aren't having babies and that there aren't adolescents and that enrollments to universities are going down, long-term trends, and that people in universities are really struggling. And then you've got the rise and emergence of things like Coursera, right? Massive open online courses. And it's sort of this like, what really is the value added now for a university, and has its purpose and function in the 21st century shifted from where it used to be? And I think there are a lot of interesting conversations that could be had into the future about that.
Yeah, Jeff, any thoughts?
I would definitely agree. I mean, Coursera, edX, I mean, they've actually shifted the paradigm now, as well as, you know, looking at your virtual students. How many students are going to attend virtual campuses? I mean, obviously for practicums and for, you know, hands-on courses, they'd have to be there. But what's to say a student can't go do their first 2 years of school online now before they actually they step foot on a physical campus? I mean, it is definitely a scary time in education for higher ed, just the way things are. And, you know, with K-12, obviously people want to keep their kids in school. A lot of times for K-6, it's because of babysitting. I mean, that's the reality of it. I hate to say it, but, you know, there was a superintendent that was chastised recently because he said, we're not a babysitting service. We're an education entity. He goes, and a lot of parents are like, I have to get back to work. My kid has to go back to school. You know, and I was like, yeah, we understand that. But I think definitely, you know, the higher ed piece, looking at Coursera, edX, and online courses as a whole, is something that's going to be, you know, shifting, say it nicely, but the quality of those courses, and, you know, that's the question I always had. I worked with a corporation that's in K-12 online ed, and, you know, I always questioned the, you know, the depth of knowledge, the rigor, and, you know, the grasp of content that student had at the end of the course, you know?
Yeah, I think I'm actually in an online MBA program. So, you know, because I was in Japan last year and had the opportunity to get in, and it fit my lifestyle very well. I think it's very different than an in-person program and what it offers and what I can get out of it. Although I do get a lot of really interesting interaction online with people. But I think there is also a lot of stuff that's missing, right? When you don't have that in person like that. I'm always interested in like that transfer of knowledge and information. What's the difference between being in the room versus on a computer? And is there something there or not? And then, and also the engagement level just in general of people. And so I'm curious what with kind of a follow-up too around this idea is as we move to a more kind of digital and data-driven world, what do leaders need to be aware of that we're going to miss, that they could miss, right? Because as it becomes like a great, especially in like a business environment or even education, it becomes great because I've got the data, I've got the digital, I don't need the in-person as much, I don't need the brick and mortar. I've got better information about what works and doesn't work, but what could we miss in that?
I think that things that can be done remotely are obviously looking at, you know, analyzing and processing information can be done remotely very, very well. Performing administrative duties can be done, updating knowledge and learning can be done by having access to courses, and then routine communications can be done. I think the biggest pieces that are going to be missing or benefit from being in person is negotiations, for one thing. You know, I'm on the other side of the fence now. I work in the business development side. So being face to face with someone over dinner and having a conversation about what you're going to do in the future together is something I think is going to be missing as a whole. Onboarding new employees and new students, I think, is difficult as well. That's something that's better done, building those relationships. Like I talked about, the, you know, emotional part of this is that people get attached to universities. Once they're part of that, they're part of it for life. You know, if they may not feel that same attachment if they're not part of the university as a whole, being on campus in one way, shape, or form, even if it's semester on, semester off, or something like that. I think coaching and mentoring probably is done better face to face. It can be done, obviously, you know, but that's again the positive relationship piece. I think that's core to all of these components that actually are going to be benefiting from it being in person.
Yeah, I would agree with everything that Jeff said. I think, you know, living in the digital world, you're probably more intrapersonal rather than interpersonal. And I think what's going to happen, what we'll be missing, I think, is just what you've done here, Tyler. It's closing the triangle. You know, it's a fundamental principle of network weaving. My good friend June Hawley put that together, and she says, so Tyler contacts me, and he contacts Jeff, and he closes the triangle. And you've done your haiku, right? You've done your little network weaving. And I think if people are in their digital silos, there won't be a lot of those closing the triangles unless people do it intentionally. And I think that's what happens when people are face-to-face at work, when you're going down the hall and you're saying, hey, I think you ought to talk to Sally because she's got this great idea and she can introduce you to Jeff. And so it's that subtle network weaving, I think, is going to be lost in the digital world unless it's built into the design and built into the network.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I started a business in Hawaii years ago, and me and my business partner, it was a media company, back when 2008 and 9, when they said print was dying, right? Everything's going online and advertising is going to be all online. And we were naive and we were like, well, we're going to start a media company, a print media company of all things, and ended up being very successful now. But I think some of the most interesting ideas we had about our company and what we could do were just us sitting around, right, talking. Yep. And it wasn't a planned meeting. It was maybe at a bar, or it was that social interaction, or even talking with other people. And then something happened from that. Just those random interactions that happen with an organization that you don't get online, right? You can't just bump into people online usually, right? Yeah. With education, I mean, a lot of people went to a certain school, at least I know in my family, because the football team, and they wanted to go to the football games, and that's what connected them to that university, and maybe even drove them to a different subject or to pick be inspired to do well in school. And, we're going to miss some of those things in the future, possibly. So I'm curious, just kind of wrapping up here because we're kind of running on time. Just if you have some last thoughts to share, just from the dialogue or just in general about this topic. I'll start with you, Jeff.
I think the biggest piece for me is that the robotics and automation, when you look at it, just how fast we were able to do things during the pandemic. The AI, machine learning, the virtual assistants, the AI enabled technologies, the fact that robots now clean hotel rooms, things like that, as well as the fact that robots even processed the vaccines to getting done that much quicker. Tools like virtual and augmented and mixed reality are going to become something more prevalent in education and workforce. I think that, BMW does a great job of it. You can actually throw on a pair of glasses and actually all the markers are already in the engine. You can actually be walked through how to fix something, how to change something. As time goes on, I'm sure that's going to happen as well. I mean, it's happening in real estate now, where you can do virtual tours of houses and things like that. The question is whether autonomous vehicles will be, in our lifetime. I think that the way things are right now, they probably will be. I mean, in the next 10 to 15 years, anybody that's thinking about the future is thinking about the fact that autonomous vehicles can decrease accidents, increase, process speed for people to get to work, make you more efficient while you're going to work as well, and things like that. So I just want to see some of these things transition into education, where you're looking at, how does the big data piece fit in while still, not violating laws like COPA and FERPA and, requirements that you have for data that you have for K-12. So I think that those pieces are components I'd love to see push education more by using the data to drive change. There's a phenomenal program called Dreambox Learning. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. They actually use 10,000 individual data points. And Jesse Woolley-Wilson's brilliant, the CEO. I've known her for many years, but it actually pulls data on how you answer the question, what you use to answer the question, and then designs your learning path based upon that. So it's not a set learning path for a child at any point. So it's going from one session to the next. Similar with the company I work for now, we're trying to do similar things in middle school and high school education as well, with our AP courses and trying to prepare kids for university.
Oh, great.
Yeah. KnowledgeWorks, I think, is all about individualized learning plans, right? They say that that's what the future is. You set the path yourself. But I want to go back, Tyler, if your folks aren't aware of these techniques, when I was with the Plexus Institute, I had the great opportunity to work with Keith McCandless and Henry Lemanowich, and they've developed a set of tools called Liberating Structures, which sort of gets at this whole notion about bringing people together in new and different ways. And there are 33 well-designed microprocesses that would be valuable for anybody's facilitation to kind of generate new ideas and to deal with critical uncertainties, do some eco-cycle planning. And It's a great website, liberatingstructures.com. And I think the future really is about people still coming together to have novel associations that are useful, to be creative, to develop the future that they want to have. And I studied with Mikola Tarlo once, and she wrote a book in the early 200s, Navigating the Future. And I just loved her quote. She says, "What the future holds for you depends on what you hold for the future." And so as each individual unfolds and makes clear their purpose, passion, virtues, and contribution, that future will unfold for them and others whom they choose to associate with, I guess.
That's great. One final question for both of you. Maybe the toughest question you'll have today is, what's one word you would like to leave for leadership to be more intelligent about the future? One word. Jeff?
Tough one. I'd probably say just empathy.
Empathy. And Daniel?
My word would be wisdom.
Wisdom. Great. Well, thank you, Daniel and Jeff, for joining me today on this podcast. Really appreciate your time, your energy, insights, and wisdom.
Thanks so much, Tyler.
Thanks, Tyler. Good to meet you, Jeff.
Great meeting you, Daniel.
Thank you for joining us today on the Flowcast. To get a summary of today's dialogue, find out more about today's guests, listen to previous episodes, or discover more about Haku Global's neuroscience-based Futures Intelligent Leadership programs or customized strategic foresight and innovation sprints, visit us at www.haku.global. At Haku Global, we believe it is time for more futures intelligent leadership. The future is something we need to think more intelligently and feel more deeply about, so we can collaborate to discover today's solutions for future problems. If you are in a leadership role and need support or training to scale futures intelligence across your organization, then contact us at Haku Global. This is your host, Tyler Mongan, and until next time, have a preferred and conscious future. Aloha.